So I was browsing Instagram the other day, and I think I mentioned this in another video, but somebody posted a render of our fruit, and I think that it turned out so good. I really liked our fruit that we created, but then this person really showed the full potential of them, and I was blown away. And it made me look more into the fruit that we created, and then I remembered I made this animation. And I know that a few people actually asked for a breakdown of this video, and I never did. However, I did do a blog over at Blender Nation because they asked for a breakdown of this, and I've done this in text form, and I thought that I would do it in video form as well, because there are actually some things which I didn't mention in the blog since I've been looking into the files again. So I'm going to try to cover those. It includes some interesting render techniques and some general physics soft body simulations and various lighting techniques. So I thought that I might as well just go through it. You might find it interesting. I hope that you like this video that I created, and yeah, let's jump straight in. Right, so let's just start straight off by saying that all of these scenes are broken down into separate Blender files, and that worked for me. I did think about making a separate scene for each, but then I kind of thought that I would just prefer it to just be a completely new Blender file, and then I can keep it organized at least in the file browser. The rest is very unorganized because I didn't really expect anyone to be looking into this file, but there are some other things I'd like to talk about which are the same throughout most of the animations, such as having these planes in the background. And these planes are basically the kitchen rendered already. So if I look at this part is actually some ovens. So that is a section of the kitchen rendered onto a plane. So if you imagine this camera here is looking in this direction, and it would be looking at a cabinet. Let's just actually copy this. Let's see if it will work. That would be looking at okay, no, let's just go into this camera. It would be looking at something like the ovens. But because this part will be so out of focus, all it's going to be doing is eating up render time. So if I render this now as a preview, we can see that there's some glass objects, there's some out of focus oven bits, and in general this scene is quite complex in the background, and I've got to render that every single time, and yet it's so out of focus that we won't really see it anyway. So I thought, well, in that case I will render that as a plane, and then I'm going to place that into the background. And so now if I preview, we can see that there are some ovens in the background, but they are not actually there. That is actually just a plane. Let me just pause that because it's crashing my computer. So you can see how powerful that is. This really does look like it is ovens in the background, and I'm sure you didn't guess that to start with. But now because it's a plane, I've set that as an emissive object. So if I go to Shade Editor, it's literally just an emission shader, which is super fast to calculate for Blender. I think it just needs one sample and then it's done, I think. And that means that the background is going to render super fast. And for an animation, we're always looking for some optimizations, as I'm always talking about animations. And for this, for 190 frames, not to have to render the background every single time is obviously ideal. And the same can be said for the other animations, such as this one here, which is the background of this shot. So if I go into this one, we'll see that there looks to be some sort of fairy lights, and that's actually a fairy lights bed that's from iMesh. Right, so there we go. So now we can see this part. So it looks like a really nice fairy light fixture in the background, but if we look at it, actually it's just a plane. But you would never have actually thought about that in the animation. Now there is one thing which I did do wrong, and that is I actually rendered it out of focus. Now that means that it's going to be out of focus already, and then when I go into camera view, which also has depth of field, now it's even more out of focus, which wasn't my ideal plan. So that means that it's almost like twice as far away as it should be. But the way I should have done it is render it completely in focus and then let the camera put it out of focus more naturally, which maybe would have looked a bit better anyway. But the final result I'm pretty happy with anyway, because it really does what I really wanted it to do. Now, there were some which may have also worked by faking the background, but it got to the point where it was getting more tedious to try to fake the background than it was just to have the normal background. So for some, it is just the normal background, as you'd imagine. Now, in terms of the lighting, I have some very simple lighting for all of them. Most of them have about a 3-point light situation going on. So that's a couple of fill lights, and then a couple of more focus lights, and then a couple of extra highlights on the side if I want to. The lighting is very, very simple. I don't think there's any HDRI going on here. It's literally just a few lights and some really good looking fruit, which helps, I guess. Right, now let's talk about the actual animation itself and the things like the simulations. So as you can see here, we've got some fruit and we have a little bit of a soft body going on. Now, I think I should have actually made this soft body a little bit softer so it does deform a little bit more. But when I was playing with the lemons, I was actually dropping lemons to see what they would look like. They were quite tough and they didn't really deform that much. But I think that in the slow-mo style that I had, it does sell it quite well. But I know some people commented that I should have added a soft body, and I did, so maybe it wasn't enough. But what I've done here is it looks a bit strange, and that's because I have two objects here, and one object is the high poly and one object is the low poly. I made the low poly the soft body, and then I made the high poly follow that. And I found that was a much more efficient way of making the simulation work. Right, so this is the fruit, and it's quite a high poly fruit. You can see all the details are already on the fruit, and in general it looks pretty good. But to try to simulate this, there's like 50,000 faces. To simulate that would be quite difficult. So what I did was I went over to Quad Remesh. Now this is a paid remesher, but I would highly recommend you check it out because it's so good. And then what I did was I remeshed it. So I said I want it to be about 350 faces, and then remesh. And then that will try its best to remesh it to your target quad faces. So there we go, we have a remeshed fruit. Now this to simulate will be much quicker than simulating the main fruit. So what I did was I got all of these retopologized lemons and then I simulated them. So we can kind of see that they're just working how they should, and that allowed me to do quite a quick simulation. I think the settings are pretty simple. Let me go over here if you're curious. So I've got them set to a collision and soft body, and the soft body settings are these ones here if you want to give it a try, and these settings. I'm not going to go into this actually how to do this in this tutorial, but if you want to give it a try, then these are the settings I'm using. But please bear in mind that the dimensions of the fruit should be the same, whereas if you're trying to do soft body and the fruit is 10 times the size, then you're going to need different settings. So these are the settings which I've used, and that worked pretty quick. There was no real problems. But if I was going to do that with the high poly fruit, I would have got a lot slower feedback to how it was turning out. So once that was done, I then needed to tie that to the high poly. So I got the high poly one here, and we can see that I have got a modifier called surface deform. So this surface deform is here, and then all I did was attach it. Oh, let's go back to the start. Like, I think it starts here, and then I just did this and clicked on the low poly, and then clicked bind. Now this high poly will follow the motion of the low poly, and it does a really good job. So now any soft body motion that goes ahead, you'll actually be able to see in the high poly, and I think that was quite a cool little trick. I gave myself a pat on the back because I thought that worked out pretty well. Now the soft body simulation itself, I think, is really too soft, but I'm happy with the result, and it kind of worked how I wanted it to anyway. Now for this one, I could have done the same thing, but I didn't. I just made them all hard body, rigid body, and I just did convex hull. I could have set this to mesh, but convex hull does a pretty good job for the simulations anyway. But I think I should have done soft body here because they really look too rigid to me. They just kind of hit the sides, and it doesn't really sell it as well as I kind of hoped. But the animation itself of the fruit falling and hitting the drawers worked out how I wanted that to, so it wasn't the end of the world. Now for the draw itself, I have actually set that to be a rigid body passive, so when the avocado hits the draw it will react to that, but I have set that to mesh. That's because of the handles like this. If I was to set this to convex hull, it would probably have made a shape like this going over it, rather than taking into consideration that some bits don't actually have a handle. So I set that to mesh, and that worked out pretty quickly to simulate alongside the convex hull. And that was probably it. I literally just set the fruit up at the top and just made it simulate and fall down, and I recorded it. Now, this one was probably the most fun to make because the fruit is really flying out of this cupboard. Now, for the gravity, I've got it set to really, really low. So that means that when they fly out, they really look like they're flying out instead of having an arc to them. Now, they will eventually fall down, I think, but in general, this is the look that I was going for. Now, how did I make them fly out like this? Okay, so I just did a little bit of digging to find out what I was doing in this, and it looks like I also retopologized all of the oranges as well to make them low poly. But then instead of binding that with the surface deform, all I did was parent these oranges to this fruit. Because they're taking up the same amount of space, they're not going to deform in any way, I just simply want them to follow it. And I found that it was quicker to simulate these low poly fruits than it was to simulate the high poly fruits. But it looks like I've also actually saved the animation out, but I do remember that for the round ones I set that to a rigid body, but then I set it literally to a sphere, because the spheres really calculate really fast, so it was much more efficient to set it as a sphere. I also had a lot of problems to start with, and I just couldn't work out why the simulation wasn't working correctly. There was two things, and that was that the scale wasn't applied. So that's when these numbers are not 1, and also the origin points were not in the correct point. The origin was like off. That meant that the rigid body was kind of rotating around nothing, and it was really strange, and it took way too long for me to figure that out, but make sure that the origin point is in the center. Now on the inside here I have just a few shelves, and they are also set to rigid body passive and convex hull. There's just need to be a very basic shell onto these, same with these ones, and everything inside. So when these fruits are sitting in here, I think that I originally simulated them sitting in there, and once that simulation was finished, I then applied that simulation. Now the oranges are ready and waiting. That's when I started the next simulation. So all I did was, you can see in the back here, I have a cube. Now this cube moves forwards, and it actually forces the fruit out. I don't know if we can see that here, but we can see that it moves forwards, and that, along with them all being in a very cramped space, and with the door being closed, they're really being forced against the door, and then as soon as the door opens, they fly out, and that's what worked there. There's nothing really special going on, I don't think, nothing of importance that I should say. I really just made every single object a passive rigid body. I made a rigid body for the actual oranges, then I just simulated it, and it just worked. If anyone hasn't tried simulating with rigid bodies yet, I'd recommend you do, because it's just so much fun when you're not pulling your hair out when it's not working, but when it really does work, it really makes for a really cool animation, and I think that it's just very pretty to see. Right, and for the next shot, what I have here is the cantaloupe, and I really think that this is one of my favorite shots from the whole thing, because I think that it falls really naturally. And that, again, I just set them how I wanted them to be, and then I set them to a convex hull, and then I just simply have a plane which they are falling onto, which is just set to passive, and that works. It just worked. I just press play, and then you can see a little fall at the start, and then they work. Now for this shot, again, it's pretty simple. The lighting, I've got 4 lights here apparently, just shining onto the cantaloupe. Then in the background I have a few more lights which I think look quite pretty. Now at this point I probably could have done that trick which I had earlier, which was to render that onto a plane, so I don't need to render the whole background every single time, but it wasn't too bad, so I just let it render, and then that was that. And then this shot I think came out really nicely. Okay, then for the final shot, and that one is the falling bread. Now this one looks a little bit wild because I have light coming in from every single side. I think that these lights were some tests, but I looked like I moved them out of the way and then left them. Maybe I didn't need them. I really don't think I used these. I think they were just shining down. But what it looks like I've done is create some sort of softbox kind of lighting around the bread, and that makes, yeah, that looks like a softbox. So it looks like I made a little softbox around the bread. Now what I've done is, because it's falling bread, you'd think that the bread was falling, but that's not actually the case. I found it was a lot easier just to move the camera. And then all I did was, for every single fruit, I just chose a rotation, like here, and pressed I, and then went to the end frame, rotated it and pressed I, and then that was done. It just then looked like all the fruit is falling. Even now it looks like the fruit is falling, but it's actually the camera moving, and I found that was way easier, because then I just needed to animate and concentrate on the rotation rather than working on the rotation and the transformation at the same time. So this one, I guess that was quite a nifty little trick that you might find interesting. Now to talk about render settings. So in all of my later videos, I say not to use this tick box. I always say to use the render node afterwards, and that's what I still recommend doing. I think I just did this in the past because it's an old render. For samples, they vary between a few of them. I think that, again, I was trying to find the sweet spot between the rendering and, yeah, so this one's set to 850. Maybe this one was a little bit slower. So if the rendering is taking too long, I might have just cramped that down a little bit just to make it render a little bit quicker. And all of them, I have also enabled this animated seed, which I actually talk about in the previous video. I think that's probably all the techniques. This was a pretty quick video. I just wanted to kind of go through all the things which I thought were interesting about this video. If there are certain parts you want me to know more about, just write a comment and I'll tell you how I did that bit. But I've been meaning to talk about this video for a little while, but I hope that you think that it turned out quite nicely. I think it's definitely one of my favorites I've ever done, and I would like to do something like this again. It's a little bit different. It's kind of a bit like ArcViz. There's a kitchen and then there's fruit, but it's more of like a still life kind of feel to it. So yeah, if you're looking to get some of this fruit, there are some free ones over at iMesh. You can download those for free, or there are more versions, more things you can download with the paid version, of course. So check that out. Otherwise, yeah, thank you very much for watching, and please like and subscribe. I hate to ask, but it does help a lot, actually. So if you can just subscribe, that would just be really sweet. Thank you very much, and see you soon.